Right. So just, yeah, quickly, Anatomy and Physiology. There's a 1,400-page book. This is by OpenStax, which is ultimately founded by the Melinda Gates Foundation. So Bill Gates' wife does a lot of philanthropical work that included putting together all of these manuals. So in general, I'm hoping that the people I'm going to be working with are like yourself. You've already seen Anatomy and Physiology. Don't want to have to go over that or reinvent it. What we're going to be looking at today is a recent initiative and publication on behalf of the ASPQ, and it has to do with the being conscious of how we treat, talk, and discuss about things about people that are overweight. So we see regularly in the news in stories and anecdotes about people being overweight and its incidence and diabetes and 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 or only 1 in 5 is proper weight and BMI, and you have to eat properly, and there's a stigmatization that exists in our society, and that may not necessarily be a good thing. So what we see here are 3 examples of pictures that are not putting into value the human being in this case, everyone's fat. We're talking about fat. Here we see 3 nice pictures. So we see a fat woman who's doing some exercise, and this is a lot more positive in terms of how we're going to be presenting things. Here we see a fat woman, and she's cooking, and she's happy to be cooking. And so this is a nice picture. So having, these characteristics of putting, the pictures in a context that shed positive messages are important. And those are some examples. So this is produced by the ASPQ. It's quite recent publication. Now I realize this is in French, so I'm kind of going to do some translating on the fly here. But we want to avoid stigmatizing people as much as possible. And as massage therapists or manual therapists, we are obviously going to be in contact with people who are fat or obese. And one of the key insights that came out of this massive study was that weight loss is incredibly difficult for certain people, and in some cases it's not even possible because the weight relates to genetics and to a whole lifetime. And so let's see here. I don't know exactly how I can turn this into an interactive session without reading it. I can use the printed copy that I have, or here we go. So these are examples of words that we want to try and avoid. So, the weight or the pain that's related to obesity, or suffering from obesity, or the obesity epidemic, or morbid obesity, which is like a BMI category. So le fardeau de l'obésité it's presented like obesity is a problem that is painful for ourselves and for others. And we might consider obesity as being a burden, which that's the word, a burden on society because it leads to medical complications. Suffering from obesity, you can be obese and happy, right? And what this document, or part of the insights that this document has, is that it's much more important for your health to accept yourself and to love yourself as you are than it is to pound yourself on the head and say, oh, well, I'm fat and therefore I'm suffering from obesity. No, you're not necessarily the person. I'm saying you, but I'm talking in an abstract form. You don't suffer from obesity. You may have it, and if you feel that you're suffering, then that's probably slightly a byproduct of news, social media, and other influences that kind of shape our perceptions about what is good and what is bad. And epidemic obesity, it describes obesity as being contagious, which it's not contagious. And so using the word epidemic or an obesity epidemic would be something to avoid talking about. And morbid obesity, the word morbid is pejorative, or it has a negative connotation associated with it. So the actual definition of obesity doesn't really change. It's still based on the BMI scale. Um, and here we
I
have
saw
some,
this.
yeah.
So I saw this or with COVID, that the people who were that had that had diabetes, um, they were among the list of people who could get the vaccines earlier. And I remember there being a lot of backlash from the general population saying that it was their own doing, their own,
Yep.
lifestyle factors. I think there was, I don't know exactly, I don't remember exactly, but I think there was one about people who smoke too, that there was like a huge backlash that, you know, just because they're overweight and we shouldn't suffer or we shouldn't be penalized because there was like not just the stigmatism of being overweight, but these people were also, even me saying these people, I'm just giving the example, is that they were prejudiced against,
Yes,
you
yes,
know
yes. Well,
and
part of the brainwashing, so to speak. I mean,
right.
the rationale behind that is it was determined, or my understanding of the rationale behind that is that it was determined that people who were like older people and people that had existing comorbidities were much more at risk. And if we go
Yes.
back to the beginning of the pandemic, then we see people dying left, right, and center at an alarming rate. That happened mostly in the first wave, because in the second wave, this is a little bit nasty to say, but you can't die twice, right? So
Right.
people that died in the first wave, they can't die in the second wave. They've already passed away. So putting I remember that discussion as well, or people saying, well, if you smoke, you shouldn't have access to healthcare because
Yeah.
you've decided to smoke. These are very ethical questions. Um,
Yeah.
Diabetes type 2, yes, there was an increase, and it keeps coming up. Diabetes type 2 is also something that people will associate with, well, if you have diabetes, you're probably overweight. And if you're overweight, it's because you're eating too much sugar. And so therefore, it's your fault. So this whole initiative by the Quebec government, or the ASPQ, aims at changing the narrative, or trying to help change the narrative, so that we can kind of shift our way of thinking away from this idea that it's somehow the obese person's fault. In some cases, it might be, but in most cases, it isn't. And in our course, we see that in the lectures on genetics and epigenetics,
Right.
which is actually like 10 or 12 years old, that book, but it still underpins this important factor that we don't necessarily have all that much control over our body weight. Yes, we can eat and exercise, but it's not that simple.
Does this document go into that, like for educational purposes, to say that, some of this is your DNA, and like you said, for some people it's impossible to lose weight. It's in their DNA. They may have some other underlying reason why they can't, or an immune function, something that's not working properly.
Yep. Unfortunately, as a society, we're generally quick to judge.
Yes, unfortunately.
Um, so what is the grossophobie, or fear of being of fat people, I suppose? So it's a group of stereotypes of
Yeah.
preconceived
Is
notions.
it fear of people who are, oh,
Yes. Well, it's kind of like, I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't end up being like that, and therefore you shouldn't either. I think that's the
mhm.
underlying thinking that many people will adopt. And I guess if you stop and reflect on it, you would say, hey, well, that's not right. But we have busy lives and perhaps don't take the time to think about it. So there's a lot of existing préjugés.
Yeah.
TV, movies, kids for kids. When you try and get a job, it could be a discrimination factor at work, at school, even in a medical context. So you can have healthcare professionals who may have not completely eradicated this notion that it's not necessarily the person's fault, and you can't be blaming them or giving them a lesser quality of service. But
Yeah.
I mean, we're human and it happens. Um, So here we have a list of negative impacts that are attributed to these attitudes or denigrative attitudes towards or la grossophobie. So it can lead to anxiety and depression, deterioration of lifestyle habits, exclusion, isolation, a bad relationship with food, or guilt, perhaps, with the food, higher risk of mortality, more stress, at multiple attempts that don't work. But which, if when all else has failed, perhaps the person might try something that's not safe. And then there's all of these behaviors. So again, these are negative, and as massage therapists or as manual workers, we're going to see a lot of people that are obese. And so these are consequences that these people can have. And chronic stress, we can give our client tools to manage the stress. Anyways, this isn't a helping relations course, but the point is there's a lot of negative things that are associated with it. I want to skip forward to another part that I really enjoyed that I want to share with you today.
Could you share this with me later, please?
Yeah, for sure. This is the this the Mhm. So here's like a nice picture. We were looking at the quality of pictures. You see a bunch of, they're happy, It's not
Yeah.
because you're fat that you can't be happy. And again, one of the main points here is it's more important to be happy with yourself and to love yourself for health than it is to lose weight.
Yeah.
This is one of the many items that are brought forward. So yeah, what often happens is, you start being slightly overweight when you're young and you grow up being overweight. And so now you've had like a whole lifetime where your cells and your metabolism, we're talking about the thyroid earlier, the thyroid will have adapted itself to years, maybe even decades of like a certain metabolic state. And so to try and then change that at age 25, 35, or 45 becomes incredibly difficult, because it's not just you gained weight in the last 6 months and you want to get rid of it. This has been with you for your whole life, and at some point it might become excessive and you're like, oh, I want to make a change. I want to lose this amount of weight. And it's incredibly difficult. Why? Because, well, your body has adapted itself to having, whatever body weight for, again, years or decades. Dum dum dum. Feel like I may have skipped something important. Or maybe I didn't even print it. Well, in any event. So
You
here
know,
I'm just,
they
yeah,
scientifically showed that people who were fit make more money than people who are overweight for doing the exact same job. And the person who is fit is more likely to get an increase in salary than the one who is not.
that seems to be like a logical, stereotypical conclusion.
Um,
Right? Right?
yeah,
Yeah. Um, and that can lead to hiring policies or adopting hiring policies for, more diversity of a workforce. But that, would be a lot easier to implement at a government or municipal level. In a private company, it's the hiring policies are subject to, who's ever's doing the hiring. In fact, I remember reading a really cool thing about hiring, which is if you have to be interviewed, then the interview itself is a biased process. Because if you're not biased, then you're objective. And if you're objective, you're going to be choosing the candidate who has the best qualifications for the job. And those qualifications have little to do with what you think as the employer or the interviewer of your employee candidate. If you're going to be objective, then you don't need to meet the candidate because you have their CV and their work experience. So the very fact of having an interview to try and remove the bias, it doesn't work. The interview itself is part of hiring biases. So I'm sharing that as
True.
so the Quebec government here in 2021, they did some statistical surveys and they found that 59% of women and 45% of men are dissatisfied with their own body weight. And that's more than, like, for women, well, 45% is pretty close to 1 out of 2 people. And if you're dissatisfied with your weight, then every time you look in the mirror, or anytime you go buy a shirt or a pair of shoes or a pair of pants, you're going to be thinking, oh, well, I have to get that one. I wish I could get that one, but no, I have to get that one. And so that's a lot of insatisfaction or unhappiness that can lead to. I'm just going to spit these out. There's about 10 of them. But you're going to feel less efficient personally, less self-esteem, a worse body image, which is by definition what 1 out of 2 Quebecers would have declared in the survey. More difficulty with social integration. You just gave a couple of examples of how that can be systematically integrated into the hiring and distribution of a workforce inside of a company. You're more at risk for developing eating disorders. You're at a higher risk for what we call emotional eating, right? So you eat to reduce stress, which kind of goes against the idea if you don't like the body image that you have in the first place. Maybe a little bit less likely to want to use medical services or facilities out of whatever reasons. There's a higher risk of psychological and distress, right? Such as, depression and anxiety as symptoms. So if you have difficulty losing weight, then you lose a certain feeling of autonomy over your own body, which is also not good for the mind. Chronic stress can contribute to a increased dysfunction of the body systems. There might be a barrier to making choices for healthy lifestyles and a higher mortality rate. So all of these things are pretty terrible. And they stem from this self-perception of self as being, I'm unhappy with my body weight, which again, Quebec government 2021 survey, 1 in 2 people. Why is this the case? Well, this is the interesting part. We already know why this is the case. We know it's from advertising, social media, and TV, right? Yet, interestingly, knowing this doesn't change the way we feel about it, which is a little bit unfortunate. But as naturopaths or as massage therapists, if we have the opportunity or it's appropriate to talk about body weight, the key message that we want to give is it doesn't matter if you're fat or skinny. Certainly, there's certain implications with that. What matters is how you feel about yourself. Do you love yourself as a fat person, or do you not love yourself? Because if you don't, then you have this all of these negative, super negative consequences. And while alternative medicine can come and address some of them, like emotional stress, that leads to other problems. How we view ourselves or the self-image of ourselves. I really like the this idea like everyone is beautiful.
Yes.
And I'm not exactly sure how to fit that into like a therapeutic session, but it's in the background of your mind or the mind of anyone who has a client who's fat, is this idea of, do they love themselves? And if they don't, try and find a way to fit that in as a comment or as a suggestion. I suppose tapping, people might use tapping, and a longer discussion might reveal.
We're even talking about self-love and taking time worthy of self-care can lead to self-love, you know, taking the time that you're worthy to take that time out of your day just for you. It's not selfish, it's necessity. And it could start with self-care and then turning it into, like, especially if someone's like later in life or even they're not going to change their way of thinking overnight, but certainly little conversations, little tips and tricks to get them to start valuing themselves, then, you know, it's a step in the right direction anyway.
Absolutely. There's this one book author, he says, when a patient comes to see him in his medical practice, and they complain about a problem, the first thing he'll say is, wait a second. You need to understand, the earth has been around for like, let's say 4.6 billion years, and like humans have been around for, X 100,000 years. And right now, today, all of these billions of years, like it's past, it doesn't exist. It's in the past.
Yeah.
But right
Yeah.
now, today, you and me in the medical clinic, you are alive. Do you realize how unlikely it is that right now you would be and I would be alive right here, right now? That is a miracle. In 100 years, neither of us will be alive. Other people will be able to say the same thing. There's like a reframing. I really
Yeah.
enjoyed that.
Yeah.
Um, so okay, now we get to like the like the nail in the cross. Like this is the slam dunk, the underlying message here, which is we need to deconstruct the message that the fat person needs to change their lifestyle habits so that they can eat better and exercise more. We need to say, or we need to start saying, as therapists, as a population, that's not the answer. That kind of thinking is what brings us to having the examples that you gave earlier about hiring policies, or about how people that are not fat have a higher salary, and all of the other examples that we gave. As long as people, including, I guess this is important for me personally, um, um, deconstructing the idea that lifestyle factors will lead to, a better weight. What matters more than anything else, and this is something that we have seen in the lifestyle factors, is to have a balance between all of them. And that social element, or like you said, loving yourself and accepting yourself, the way you are, will ultimately make you healthier than losing the weight, because our perception of ourselves, um, is extremely important in all of these things. So again, and I'll start recording here if I am recording. I think I am. The Quebec government is suggesting, and I think we can fully endorse, the underlying idea that fat people, their solution is not eat less and exercise more. That very thinking itself is flawed, and has a whole bunch of negative consequences that we've gone through together. I would add one last thing, that apparently nutritionists and dietitians in Quebec, which is a regulated profession, as you know, they are going in the direction of saying it's actually unethical to tell a client, hey, you need to exercise more and eat better, and that's how you're going to lose your weight. So this is perhaps not a systematic position taken by the order. I don't represent the order, and I have not spoken to the order about this. But the Quebec government did consult with the Order of Nutritionists and Dietitians, and a lot of them are taking this position that absolutely we need to change the discourse. And one of those things is for them is feeling that it's unethical. Why is it unethical? Because of all the reasons that we've talked about up to now, which is you don't necessarily have as much control over your weight as might generally be perceived.